Chapter 5. Reincarnation hits too close to home. Nebene and Shirin. The summer of 1971 went quickly. Monday and Wednesday nights, after supper, I'd do the dishes, take a short walk, and then, around 9, have a Seth session. Seth was finishing his own first book, Seth Speaks, The Eternal Validity of the Soul. The last few chapters contained some material dealing with biblical times. Neither of us knew much about the Bible, so Rob spent a great deal of time studying reference books so that his own commentaries in Seth Speaks would be correct. To his surprise, he discovered that biblical authorities differed considerably on the dates of even important events. To my surprise, I discovered that Rob got quite irascible when he was poring through the reference books. At first, I thought little about it. After all, he wanted his notes to be accurate. Gradually, though, I became more and more aware of his increasing irritability. Several times I came upon him muttering to himself as he searched for some date or another. An intense yet subdued fury seemed to drive him. He stood one night, really scowling, a book open on his drawing table. His face was white, drawn, and angry in the light from the long-armed table lamp. "Hun, you're going to so much trouble," I said. "Do your notes really have to be so detailed? I guess they just don't have definite dates for lots of biblical events." "But why don't they?" he demanded. Then he said sharply, "Do you know? When was John the Baptist born?" "How should I know?" I answered, half laughing. "Well, somebody should know. These so-called experts don't know anything." He turned abruptly back to his notes, ignoring me completely, and puzzled. I went back to my own study. The next night, the whole matter came to a head. Sue Watkins came over, bringing some reference books, the Dead Sea Scrolls and Will Durant's Caesar and Christ. Sue had a friend with her, a young man we'd met a few times before. Our voices carried to Rob's studio, I knew, so I expected him to come out to join us, particularly since Sue had made a special trip over to give him the books. But Rob worked for more than an hour on his notes before finally coming into the living room. Then, instead of greeting Sue and her friend Tim, as he usually would, he turned to the books instead and leafed through them impatiently. He'd read a few passages, then stare haughtily at Sue or me and say, "See, they don't know. The so-called experts contradict themselves constantly." He kept this up, reading a few passages, then remarking in his way, for nearly an hour. I kept staring at him, Rob of all people, practically pinning Sue and Tim to the couch, while he force-read them portions of religious history. I couldn't get over it. I'd never seen Rob act that way before. Usually he's a most considerate host, but whenever anyone tried to change the conversation, he'd just look up rather coldly, then continue with his reading and comments. I caught Sue's eye. She looked over and shrugged comically. "Hon, why don't you tell us about the records and straighten out all those wrong dates?" I laughed, thinking that my joking question would snap Rob out of it. Instead, he turned to me and said seriously, "Don't you understand? I'm concerned because of the stupidity involved. It's a simple enough thing to keep records." Sue and I broke out laughing. I tried to tell Rob how differently he was behaving than he usually did, but he couldn't see it. Not only that, but there wasn't a shred of humor in his attitude. Twice I started to say something, and he cut me off so rudely that I felt confused and humiliated. I'm very good at picking up Rob's feelings, though, and he simply wasn't angry at me. Where was the anger I felt coming from? Was I upset at Rob, hiding it and then projecting it outward? No, I was sure it wasn't that. Yet Rob was displaying strong disapproval, and that disapproval somehow made me want to bait him. Finally, Sue and I both started asking Rob about records again with a mock seriousness. Just at this point, I suddenly saw a sharp and brilliant mental image of a tall man in a long robe standing behind Rob's chair. He wore a pointed hat and looked very formidable and disapproving indeed. His presence was unmistakable. Sue sat across the coffee table from me, facing Rob. Something made me glance over at her as soon as I saw the figure. Sue literally shrank back on the couch, her face bright red and her eyes wide open, staring. I hadn't said a thing about what I was seeing. Involuntarily, I said, "Sue," meaning, "What's wrong?" Why, I'm really afraid of Rob suddenly. Intimidated is a better word. She kept staring at him, obviously astonished by her own reaction. Really? Rob spoke so innocently that I swore he didn't realize what was happening. But when I said, "Hon, I think you know more about those biblical records than you realize," he answered in quite a normal voice, "Yes, I do." I didn't know why I made the comment to begin with, and I still saw the man standing behind Rob's chair. I didn't want to mention my vision, hoping that others might become aware of the figure without any clues from me. I knew that the man in the robes was somehow connected both with Rob and the records. "Tell me what you know," I said to Rob, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Or I'll ask questions if you want, and you try to answer them automatically." As I spoke, I felt that the figure behind Rob wanted to speak, and thought that Rob might find himself effortlessly expressing the other personality's ideas. Suddenly I realized that Rob had been doing that all night. "All right," Rob said. Sue hadn't taken her eyes off his face. Her friend Tim hadn't said a word. "What do you know about the records of the time?" I asked. "I kept them," Rob spoke quietly and evenly. "Is that why you've been so upset?" "Yes, I was there." "Did you know Christ or Paul?" "No, but I heard of them. I kept records." "What was your name?" Naz something. I can't get the rest." Sue was staring at Rob with the most intent expression, so I said to him, "Do you have anything to say to the girl on the couch?" Again, I didn't know why I asked that particular question either, except for Sue's intentness. Rob looked directly at Sue then and said, "You are quite a problem." He spoke quietly in his own voice, but there was an alien quality to it too. I barely had time to notice this, though, when he and Sue began speaking at once, so quickly that the conversation was difficult to follow. They both began describing an identical scene, a school in Rome, agreeing on everything from the building's construction to the seating arrangements of the students. Sue spoke much more emotionally than Rob, but the two of them interrupted each other frequently. Rob would mention some detail. Sue would say impatiently, yes, of course, and do you remember, and off they'd go again. According to the conversation, Rob had been a teacher named Nebene in a school run by Sue's parents at the time. I was surprised for several reasons. Rob's psychic experience, till then, had centered on his paintings and various kinds of internal or exteriorized images that he used for models. Outside of that, and some out-of-body experiments, he'd more or less left psychic experimentation up to me. I also knew that he was well aware of my ambiguous feelings toward reincarnational dramas in class. As Sue and Rob talked, I still sensed the man behind Rob's chair. Finally, he turned his attention to me. He wanted me to act as a psychic go-between, and now there was no doubt of his identity. This was Nebene. Rob was going along with the experience, but it was obvious to me that he was also cautious and inhibiting some strong emotions out of consideration for Sue. This holding back angered Nebene. I was having trouble trying to follow Sue and Rob's excited conversation, while at the same time Nebene kept mentally communicating with me, wanting me to make his presence known. So I interrupted and described the image of Nebene. Then I stood up behind Rob's chair to show where the form was. As soon as I did this, the invisible Nebene yelled at me mentally, "Have him tell her about the clay tablet. Tell her what it meant. Tell her what it meant to the school," he said. He was obviously furious and now ready to speak through me. I held off and decided to relay the message instead. For one thing, Nebene's attitude toward me didn't exactly win me over. He obviously considered me frivolous, beneath his notice, and he couldn't understand how such a person could be so psychically gifted. I sensed his strongly disciplined character at once, but his perfectionist tendencies had been allowed to completely dominate his creativity. I didn't like him, and I refused to speak for him, though this took a good bit of effort on my part. My own voice sounded like a whisper compared to his mental voice shouting at me, but I said to Rob, "Tell her about the time she broke the clay tablet." Sue yelled, "Oh!" before I finished speaking. Now all warmth vanished from Rob's voice. "You broke the tablet in half, deliberately. And I ran home, and you told my father." Sue was near tears. At this point, Nebene tried to get me to speak for him again, and again I refused. As I did, Sue looked up and caught her breath, and Rob suddenly turned toward me. "Jane's face is changing," Sue cried, and I did feel funny. Taller, taut, almost cold. Most of all, I felt as if my features were older, the chin becoming very tight, and the lips tucked in and pinched. "Hun, are you all right?" Rob asked. I nodded, half angry and half amused, because through Rob's concern, Nebene suddenly understood that Rob and I were man and wife. He backed away, scowling. As Rob held my hand for a moment, my features cleared. Mentally, I told Nebene what I thought of him. Still, I was struck by the mobility of his reactions, and the fact that our present hadn't been known to him beforehand. At least it didn't seem to be, because he seemed quite surprised to discover that Rob was married. In fact, Rob's concern for me took some of the wind out of Nebene's sails, and finally I didn't sense his presence anymore. Rob, Sue, and I were all tired. We decided that we'd each write up our own notes of the night's activities and called it a night. In bed, as Rob was dropping off to sleep, he turned to me and said drowsily, "My father was in that class too. I just saw him as a girl." Right after breakfast the next morning, the phone rang. It was Sue. She spoke excitedly, but gradually I found out what had happened. She started to write her account of the Nebene episode, when suddenly automatic writing took over, and she was writing for the girl she had been as Nebene's pupil. Her name then was Shirin. The sheets of paper quickly filled up with Shirin's scrawling script. When the writing stopped, Sue went about her daily housework. As she swept the floor, however, she was overwhelmed by a deep sense of sorrow. Appalled, she stood there until she realized that this was Shirin's grief over the death of a brother back in the past. "It's been some morning," Sue said, and promised to bring the notes over to us that evening. It was a Friday, and we also expected our friends Peg and Bill Gallagher to visit. As it was, Sue arrived at first that night. Blushing, she made a joke reference to a pie for the teacher and thumped down a homemade pie and a six-pack of beer. A gesture to Nebene, I thought. But Rob was still painting in the studio. Looking embarrassed, Sue handed me the notes, and I read them while we waited for Rob and the Gallaghers. There were several pages. I'm quoting a few paragraphs here because the episode mentioned was so pertinent in the relationship between Nebene and Shirin. As I read, I felt Sue's scrutiny. The passage is directed to Nebene. "There was something you said in class one day, something you really hollered at me about. You just let go and went up one side of me and down the other, because I wasn't bothering with my lessons or the stupid formulae and rules, and you yelled about my being no better than the illiterate whores in Rome, and that's how I'd turn out. You said that in front of all those other brats, and I grabbed those tablets in a fury, those tablets that you'd gotten the stuff for in Greece when you went there, and I smashed those tablets right against the wall, as hard as I could, smash, 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 right into the wall, and the pieces flew all over the room, and the noise was still ringing in that room when I was running and screaming down the aisle. I ran all the way home and went to my father. I was still screaming with fury, but he didn't sympathize with me at all. He punished me because I'd done something awful to you, and he respected and understood you. My father was a calm, firm man, and the two of you talked a lot. I hated you for a long time after that, but my father made me go back to that school, but I wouldn't look at you or listen no matter what you said. But I knew by then that I'd ruined something very precious to you, and I was sorry, and I didn't like myself much for it, but I was proud. Oh God, was I proud, and I couldn't say anything to you after that." Actually, this entire quoted passage was written almost like one long sentence, separated here and there with "and." The words "smash, smash, smash" were in capital letters and underlined. Fresh emotion rushed out of the written words, and seemingly out of the paper itself. I was almost embarrassed to meet Sue's eyes, but just as I finished reading the notes, the Gallaghers knocked at the door. A moment later, Rob came out from the studio. I handed the notes to him. The room must have been charged, because the Gallaghers stopped in the middle of the room before sitting down. "What's going on?" Bill asked. "Nothing," Rob said, and immediately he sat down and began to read the notes. I grinned uneasily and said something like, "Rob and Sue have this past life thing going on." Sue just shrugged, and the Gallaghers and I began an innocuous conversation. In the meantime, an emotion so smooth and easy that it almost escaped me, Sue slid from the couch and sat in front of it on the floor. She rested her elbows on the long coffee table and looked up steadily at Rob as he read. Instantly, I realized that her body language was important. She'd taken the same sort of position in relation to Rob as the one she'd described with Nebene in the classroom. Rob went on reading. "Well," Sue said with a touch of defiance. "I just finished it this minute," Rob said. "The part I remember myself most is the description of your father. I see him in my mind so clearly that I could paint his portrait now. I don't recall yelling at you, though, as you say in these notes." And Sue was Sue Shirin, or Shirin Sue. Rob had sounded more or less like himself, though he was obviously speaking to Shirin, but Sue seemed much more Shirin than Rob seemed like Nebene. "You don't remember?" she shouted out. "You only called me a whore in front of the entire class. It damn near haunted me all my life, and you don't remember." "If that's what I said, then I'm sorry. I mean it," Rob said. "But your father is far more vivid in my memory, if my memory is what you want to call it, than you are." I thought that Sue Shirin was going to cry, and Rob was blocking Nebene quietly, stubbornly, but quite effectively. As soon as Rob said he remembered Shirin's father better than he did her, then the Shirin and Sue began baiting the Nebene and Rob, trying to draw him out. She was just daring him to show himself, while Rob, I knew, was just as determined to keep him under control. Sue said, innocently enough, "It would be great, though, to find out more about those old records." "I'm willing enough," Rob said, but his voice was mild and noncommittal. Sue scowled, and I realized that Shirin and Sue was demanding attention from Nebene, as she always used to, while Rob was reacting exactly like Nebene and withholding it, though now for entirely different reasons. I pointed this out to Rob. When I did, he looked directly at Sue and said, "I'm sorry, and you've changed a lot, but so have I." Then, with no transition, he went into the kitchen for more beer. He'd no sooner gone through the door when Sue yelled and pointed to the doorway, "It's him, Nebene, three-dimensional." Bill Gallagher grabbed a pen and scribbled down her description of what she saw. Sue whispered it to us, her eyes never leaving the doorway. Nebene was solid, not ghostly, about 5'10". He wore a dark blue robe with huge sleeves, apparently the same one that I saw him in, mentally, the night before. He was thin, his neck cords sticking out. His nose was long, and the lower portion of his face sunken. His lips pursed in a clipped, tight smile. He looked about 45. Sue saw him for several minutes. Then he disappeared. When Rob returned, the whole thing was over. Sue's description matched my mental image of Nebene, though this time I hadn't seen anything. Neither had Peg nor Bill. Rob didn't seem a bit surprised either. The conversation returned to biblical times and the Dead Sea Scrolls, subjects about which I know little, and that night they just didn't interest me at all. So I just sat there, listening, letting the words go over my head. My glance drifted over to Sue, who still sat on the floor. She wasn't taking part in the conversation either. Then I did a double take. This girl wasn't Sue. She had the same coloring and general features, but there the similarity ended. Peeking out through Sue's eyes, Shirin showed herself so blatantly that I caught my breath. She struck me at once as unusually alive, immediate and vital, no matter who she was or what was happening. This personality showing through Sue was as responsive and agile as an animal. As I watched, Shirin took over Sue's features completely. The transformation was fascinating to watch. Shirin stared out with belligerent curiosity into the room, studying everything on the table in turn. There was a strong sense of covert behavior, a sly delight in getting away with what she was doing, and a determination to take full advantage of the opportunity. Click, click, click. You could see her file away each bit of information for future use. To me, she seemed to be a greedy, grimy, mean little girl of about 12 or 13, shrewd, highly intelligent, loaded with energy, but unloved and furious at the world. I didn't dare to draw any attention to her, for fear she'd vanish. Rob and the Gallaghers went on with their animated conversation. They seemed lost in it. I sat there, stunned, watching. My heart went out to the girl, though, because this was the real Shirin, not the little lady suggested in certain passages of Sue's notes, not included here, where she laid great merit on her parents' wealth and social position. This was a little slut of a child, and one bright enough to know it. In the beginning, her slit speculative eyes just went from object to object. What were those things? What were they used for? You could see the questioning. Then, as I watched, the head lowered, the jaw jutting out, and in one swift sideways motion, Shirin stared boldly at Peg Gallagher. One full look. Then the head lowered again. This gesture was repeated with Bill, and then triumphantly with Rob. Again I nearly gasped. This girl was alive, here and now. I remembered Joel speaking for Dave in class. How counterfeit or one-dimensional Joel's performance seemed in contrast to Shirin's vital legitimacy. While I was thinking about this, Shirin stared at Rob again. This time, involuntarily, I whispered his name. Rob stopped in mid-sentence, turned toward me, and Shirin disappeared in a flash. I explained what had happened. The Gallaghers hadn't noticed anything. They'd been completely engrossed in the conversation. Rob had sensed Shirin's presence, though, and I think he purposely avoided the situation for Sue's sake. Sue had been aware of Shirin's feelings and reactions all the time. I could feel her peeking out at a world that was strange to her, getting a first-hand look at Nebene, or at who Nebene is now. Sue grinned and added, she couldn't get over the fact that Rob and I are friends, or that I wasn't in a subordinate position anymore. But I was staring uncomfortably at Rob, and suddenly making some connection of my own. I knew Nebene too, but in a different way. What about those times in our marriage when Rob seemed taken over by an uncharacteristic coldness? When an implacable insistence on perfection suddenly possessed him? These characteristics would rise now and then, seemingly from nowhere, and then vanish. And I always reacted to Rob, then, exactly as I did to Nebene. What part had Nebene played in our marriage? I said what I was thinking, and wondered aloud what particular remarks of mine might trigger Nebene-like responses from Rob. Before Rob could answer, Sue spoke up so quickly that one word fell over the other. "Wait, I get it," she said. Each of us relates to certain past aspects of ourselves and other people too. It's like solving problems all across the board. One incident in the present acting like a magnet to attract a personality, say, that lived 3 centuries back. For a moment we were quiet. We teetered on the edge of knowing. Peg Gallagher said slowly, like Nebene and Shirin, working out old problems tonight in our present. But in their present too, I almost shouted, because I caught another glimpse of Shirin peeking through Sue's eyes. Seldom have I seen pure emotion as honestly and clearly in anyone's face, reflecting so exquisitely the inner guises of being. Was Shirin newly born that night, I wondered, brought to life in response to a Nebene who was a personification of certain buried elements in Rob's being? Did a Nebene require a Shirin, and vice versa? Were the two personalities bringing themselves up to date with amazing rapidity, grabbing memories literally out of the air? Were we witnessing the birth of personality, seeing in accelerated form a process that might really take place in us constantly, usually showing only in the gradual change we show through time? Or were we seeing two persons who died in our terms long before any of us were born? If so, then, death, where is thy sting? I thought, because I guarantee that Nebene and Shirin are as alive as I am. I stared at Rob. He seemed perfectly himself. Then where had Nebene gone? Other selves flickering in and out of our glances. Other moods, once ours, rising up the stairs of the molecules. Again, I caught the hint of some knowledge that could vastly illuminate our current concepts and shed new light upon our own behavior. But it would be another year before I understood that night's significance. The strong emotions that had charged the room were gone, but we were still riding down invisible psychological hills. Once Sue asked Rob about the records again. He looked up and said in an absent-minded way, I was a cut above the ordinary citizen. I knew a lot about what went on because of my work. It was about AD 30. Some of the records I left in the busy northwest section of Nazareth, Zabadi. He paused, blinking. I don't know why I said that, or where it came from, but there are more records. I hid them outside of Damascus, in caves. She knows. And he pointed at Peg Gallagher. Peg just sat staring at him. You do know, he said. Peg's eyes widened. Why, I'm seeing something, she said. A big tree on a hill. No, it's a flat-topped plateau. It's sort of an orange color. I'm almost getting a name. Her Rogba, I said, suddenly, separating the syllables. That's it, Peg answered. And Sue was suddenly Shirin. She turned to Bill Gallagher, her throat muscles moving compulsively. You. The furiously uttered words were all she got out before Sue clamped down and came back to herself. What's the matter? Bill asked. Was I there too? Did I rape you or something? He was joking, but his face was bright red, and he was still shocked by Shirin's vehemence. Sue was blushing. You were a soldier. At least that's what I'm getting. A dirty old man type. Bill didn't say a thing for the rest of the evening. Very shortly, he said it was time to call it a night. Usually, he has a special word for Sue before he leaves, but that night he walked past her as if she weren't there. We'd eaten Sue's pie. I told her to wait while I washed the dish. Instead, Rob took it into the kitchen, washed it, and returned it to Sue with a particularly gallant gesture. Nebene, I thought, making amends. The night was over, but its implications rested in my mind, and the questions it presented hung unanswered. We weren't finished with Nebene or Shirin, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of the concepts in aspect psychology weren't born that night. If so, then Nebene and Shirin did us more service than we knew. End of chapter 5.